August 7, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The Midwestern summer air hung thick with humidity, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and distant pine forests. Inside the prisoner of war compound, beneath the shade of elm trees planted decades before the war began, a Japanese soldier named Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto sat at a wooden picnic table, staring at the metal tray before him as though it contained something impossible. Steam rose from mashed potatoes covered in brown gravy. Next to them sat a thick cut of roasted beef, pink in the center, alongside green beans glistening with butter. A slice of white bread, soft and pillowy, rested on the side. In a small compartment of the tray sat a square of chocolate cake, dark and rich, topped with a swirl of cream. Yamamoto's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the fork, a real metal fork, not bamboo, not his fingers. He had not eaten meat in 16 months. He had not seen butter in 2 years. He had not tasted chocolate since before he left Tokyo in 1942. Around him, 200 other Japanese prisoners sat at identical tables, eating in near silence. Some ate slowly, methodically, as though afraid the food would vanish if they moved too quickly. Others ate with barely controlled desperation, years of deprivation erased by abundance that seemed to violate everything they had been taught about their enemy. American guards stood at intervals around the compound, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, watching not with hostility but with something closer to indifference. One guard leaned against a fence post, smoking a cigarette, occasionally glancing at the prisoners but mostly staring off toward the horizon where the sun was beginning its evening descent. There was no tension in his posture, no anticipation of violence. This was routine for him. For the Japanese prisoners, it was a reality that shattered everything they thought they knew about capture, about America, about the nature of the war itself. Yamamoto took his first bite of the beef. The flavor exploded across his tongue, rich and complex, salt and fat and the char from cooking, a taste his body had almost forgotten existed. He closed his eyes involuntarily, and for a moment he was back in Tokyo before the war, at a restaurant his father had taken him to on his 20th birthday, eating sukiyaki and laughing about things that no longer mattered. When he opened his eyes, he was still in Wisconsin, still a prisoner, still alive in ways he had not expected to be. Across from him, another soldier was crying silently, tears running down his cheeks as he ate mashed potatoes. No one acknowledged the tears. Everyone understood. This moment, repeated in dozens of American prisoner of war camps across the Pacific Theater and the continental United States between 1943 and 1945, represented something more profound than simple sustenance. It represented the collision between ideology and reality, between what Japanese soldiers had been taught about American weakness and what they experienced in captivity. The food on those metal trays, abundant and rich and freely given, became a symbol of the vast gulf between Japanese propaganda and American material power. And for thousands of Japanese soldiers, that first meal in American custody marked the beginning of a psychological transformation that would challenge everything they had believed about duty, honor, and the nature of their enemy. To understand what that first meal meant to Japanese prisoners, one must first understand what they had experienced before capture. The Imperial Japanese Army's logistics system, even in the best of times, operated on margins that Western militaries would have considered unacceptable. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spirit over material, the warrior's will over the soldier's stomach. The standard Japanese military ration, when it was available, consisted of rice, pickled vegetables, dried fish, and occasionally small amounts of meat. The daily caloric allocation was approximately 2,800 calories per day, less than American or German soldiers received, but theoretically sufficient for basic operations. The problem was that this theoretical allocation rarely matched reality, especially after 1943, when American submarines began systematically destroying Japanese supply convoys. By 1944, Japanese soldiers in isolated garrisons across the Pacific were subsisting on far less than official rations specified. On islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and later the Philippines, Japanese troops were often reduced to foraging for food, eating roots, insects, and anything else that could provide calories. Beriberi and other nutritional deficiency diseases became common. Soldiers lost dramatic amounts of weight, their bodies consuming muscle and fat to maintain basic functions. Letters captured from Japanese soldiers describe a constant, grinding hunger that never left, a preoccupation with food that dominated thoughts during every waking hour. One soldier on Bougainville wrote in his diary that he dreamed every night of rice balls and fish, dreams so vivid that waking was almost unbearable. Another described the desperate mathematics of survival. How many days could he stretch a handful of rice? Which plants were poisonous and which merely tasted like poison but wouldn't kill him? This material deprivation was wrapped in an ideology that taught Japanese soldiers that surrender was worse than death, that capture meant dishonor not just for the soldier but for his family, his ancestors, his entire lineage. The Senjinkan, the Imperial Japanese Army's Field Service Code issued in 1941, explicitly stated that Japanese soldiers must never suffer the shame of being taken alive. Death in battle was glorious. Capture was unthinkable. This indoctrination was reinforced through brutal training, through stories of American atrocities, through constant repetition that the enemy was barbaric and cruel. Japanese soldiers were told that Americans tortured prisoners, that they would be killed slowly. That surrender meant suffering worse than any battlefield death. Some of this propaganda reflected genuine Japanese fears, but much of it was deliberate psychological manipulation, designed to ensure soldiers fought to the death, rather than burden the army with prisoners who might share intelligence. The result was that very few Japanese soldiers surrendered in the early years of the Pacific War. At Guadalcanal, American forces captured only about 1,000 Japanese troops out of approximately 30,000 engaged. Most Japanese soldiers who were taken prisoner were unconscious from wounds or too weak from disease to resist. The few who surrendered consciously often did so only after weeks of isolation and starvation had broken their will to continue. American forces initially struggled to understand this behavior, which seemed irrational from a Western military perspective. By 1943, however, American intelligence had begun to recognize that Japanese soldiers could be encouraged to surrender if they were shown that capture did not mean torture and death. The tool for this psychological warfare was surprisingly simple: food. The first organized efforts to use food as a psychological weapon against Japanese troops began in 1943 in the Solomon Islands. American forces began dropping leaflets over Japanese positions, showing photographs of captured Japanese soldiers eating substantial meals, looking healthy and well treated. The leaflets included simple messages in Japanese. You will not be killed. You will be fed. You will be given medical care. These early efforts had limited success, in part because Japanese soldiers assumed the photographs were faked, propaganda as false as their own officers' claims about American weakness. But occasionally, starving Japanese soldiers would emerge from the jungle and surrender, and their testimonies began to filter back through various channels that perhaps the American claims were true. The turning point came after the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, where American forces captured a small number of Japanese prisoners who were subsequently transported to POW camps in Hawaii. These prisoners, after weeks of adequate food and medical care, looked dramatically different from their emaciated state at capture. Some gained 30 or 40 pounds in the first month of captivity. American intelligence officers, recognizing an opportunity, began using these recovered prisoners in propaganda efforts. Photographs and even audio recordings of prisoners describing their treatment were produced and distributed. The credibility of these materials was higher because the prisoners themselves were visibly healthy, evidence that contradicted everything Japanese military doctrine claimed about American treatment of prisoners. By 1944, as the American advance across the Pacific accelerated and more Japanese garrisons became isolated and faced starvation, surrender rates began to increase. Not dramatically, the cultural and ideological barriers remained powerful, but measurably. On Saipan in June 1944, approximately 5,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians surrendered or were captured out of a total Japanese force of about 30,000. Many of these prisoners were in terrible physical condition, starving and sick. Their first encounter with American prisoner of war processing included immediate medical care and food, substantial amounts of food by any standard, but especially by comparison to what they had been eating for months. The standard American military ration in World War II reflected the industrial and agricultural abundance of the United States in ways that went far beyond simple caloric content. The American Army provided its soldiers, and by extension its prisoners, approximately 4,000 calories per day, significantly more than Japanese rations even at their best. More importantly, American rations included substantial amounts of meat, dairy products, fresh vegetables when available, and refined sugar. The cultural symbolism of these foods cannot be overstated. To Japanese soldiers raised in a society where meat was eaten rarely and dairy products were virtually unknown, the American diet seemed almost decadent, proof of a soft and materialistic culture, unsuited for the hardships of war. But American abundance was not softness. It was the expression of an industrial economy that could produce food at scales Japanese planners found difficult to comprehend. The United States during World War II was feeding not only its own military forces, but also providing significant food aid to allied nations through Lend-Lease. American agricultural production increased dramatically during the war years, despite the draft taking farmers into military service, a testament to mechanization and industrial farming practices. This abundance extended to prisoner of war camps, where Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner treatment were not just met, but often exceeded. The logic was partly humanitarian but also practical. Well-fed prisoners were healthier, more cooperative, and represented walking advertisements for American treatment should word reach Japanese-held territories. When a Japanese prisoner arrived at an American POW camp, the processing followed a standard pattern. First came medical evaluation and treatment. Prisoners suffering from wounds, disease, or malnutrition received immediate care. American medical personnel were often shocked by the physical condition of Japanese prisoners, particularly those captured from isolated garrisons. Weights 30 to 50 pounds below healthy levels were common. Tropical diseases, parasites, and dental problems went far beyond anything American doctors typically encountered. The treatment provided was not merely basic but comprehensive, including dental work, surgery when necessary, and extended recovery periods. After medical processing came the first meal. This meal, standardized across American POW camps, typically included meat, potatoes or rice, vegetables, bread, and dessert. Coffee or milk was provided as a beverage. The portions were substantial, calculated to begin addressing nutritional deficits without overwhelming digestive systems that had adapted to near starvation. For many Japanese prisoners, this first meal represented more food than they had eaten in a week or sometimes a month. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. The food was real, it was abundant, and it was given freely, without apparent ulterior motive beyond the requirement to maintain prisoner health. Corporal Yamamoto, sitting in Camp McCoy in August 1945, was not unusual in his response to that first meal. Interviews with Japanese POWs conducted after the war reveal remarkably consistent reactions. Disbelief was common. Many prisoners initially assumed the food was a trick, that they were being fattened for some later cruelty. But as days turned into weeks and the food continued, 3 meals a day, that disbelief turned into confusion and then into a fundamental questioning of what they had been taught. If the Americans were so wealthy they could feed prisoners this well, what did that say about Japanese claims of American weakness? If American guards showed no particular cruelty and often surprising kindness, what did that say about propaganda describing American barbarism? The symbolic power of food in these encounters cannot be reduced to simple material abundance. Food carried cultural meaning that went to the heart of ideological differences between Japan and America. Japanese military culture emphasized austerity and sacrifice, the idea that hardship built character and that material comfort was weakness. The sparse Japanese military diet was not just a logistical necessity. It was a philosophical statement about what kind of men made the best soldiers. American abundance challenged this philosophy at its foundation. If Americans, eating their beef and butter and chocolate cake, could defeat Japanese soldiers who had been hardened by deprivation, then perhaps the entire premise of Japanese military philosophy was flawed. Moreover, the manner in which food was provided carried symbolic weight. American camps operated on schedules, with meals served at regular times in organized mess halls. Prisoners lined up, received their trays, sat at tables, and ate with utensils. The orderliness of it, the predictability, contrasted sharply with the chaos and desperation of foraging for food in a combat zone. One prisoner later described the experience of eating in an American POW camp as the first time in years he had felt like a human being rather than an animal struggling to survive. The simple dignity of sitting at a table with a plate of food, knowing another meal would come in a few hours, represented a return to civilization after prolonged immersion in barbarism. The food itself served as a daily reminder of American industrial capacity. The beef came from vast cattle ranches in Texas and Montana, processed in massive meatpacking plants in Chicago and Kansas City, transported across oceans in refrigerated ships. The bread came from wheat grown across millions of acres of American farmland, milled in industrial facilities, baked in camp kitchens. The vegetables came from California's Central Valley, the dairy products from Wisconsin and other dairy states. Every meal was a demonstration of supply chains that functioned smoothly despite the demands of global war. Supply chains that the Japanese had never been able to seriously disrupt despite years of submarine warfare. When a Japanese prisoner ate a meal in an American camp, he was consuming not just food but proof of American economic power. The transformation that occurred in many Japanese prisoners as a result of this treatment went beyond simple physical recovery. Letters written by Japanese POWs to family members in Japan, monitored by American censors, reveal a gradual shift in perspective that American intelligence found both useful and somewhat unsettling. Prisoners began to express doubt about Japanese propaganda. They questioned whether they had been told the truth about America. Some went further, suggesting that Japan could not win a war against a nation with such vast resources. These sentiments remained private for the most part, shared only in letters or in quiet conversations among prisoners, but they represented a significant erosion of the ideological certainty that had sustained Japanese military resistance. American intelligence officers recognized the potential value of cooperative Japanese prisoners and began programs to leverage their changing attitudes. The most successful of these efforts involved using prisoners as broadcasters and leaflet writers in psychological operations aimed at Japanese troops still fighting. These propaganda efforts emphasized the treatment prisoners received, particularly the food and medical care, and encouraged Japanese soldiers to surrender rather than die uselessly. The credibility of these messages was enhanced by the visible health of the prisoners making them. Photographs of former Japanese soldiers, now well-fed and smiling, appeared in leaflets dropped over Japanese positions. The message was clear and simple. Surrender means survival, food, and humane treatment. The effectiveness of these psychological operations is difficult to measure precisely, but surrender rates did increase as the war progressed into 1945. On Okinawa, the last major battle before Japan's surrender, approximately 7,400 Japanese military personnel surrendered out of a defending force of about 77,000, a significantly higher percentage than in earlier campaigns. While multiple factors contributed to this increase, including the deteriorating Japanese strategic situation and the breakdown of unit cohesion, there is evidence that food-centered propaganda played a role. Japanese soldiers who surrendered at Okinawa reported that they had heard about American treatment of prisoners, that they knew they would be fed and cared for, and that this knowledge influenced their decision to lay down arms. The symbolic object that recurs throughout these stories, the thread that connects individual experiences across thousands of prisoners, is the white bread that appeared at nearly every meal in American camps. White bread, soft and refined, represented American industrial food production at its most characteristic. To Japanese prisoners, accustomed to rice as the staple grain, white bread was exotic and symbolically loaded. It was sweet, much sweeter than rice, a product of refined wheat and added sugar. It was soft, almost decadently so, requiring no effort to chew. It appeared in seemingly unlimited quantities, with prisoners often allowed seconds or thirds. Some prisoners, in interviews conducted decades after the war, remembered that white bread more vividly than any other aspect of their captivity. One veteran described how he would save his bread from breakfast and eat it slowly throughout the day, marveling at the softness, the sweetness, the sheer availability of it. Another described white bread as the taste of America itself, a distillation of everything that made the United States different from Japan, abundant, sweet, soft, and seemingly infinite in supply. The bread was not just food. It was a daily reminder that the ideological foundations of Japanese military culture might be built on false premises. If American soldiers, raised on soft white bread and chocolate cake, could defeat Japanese soldiers hardened by rice and deprivation, then perhaps material abundance was not weakness but strength. Perhaps the ability to produce unlimited food was more strategically valuable than the ability to endure unlimited hardship. This realization did not come easily or universally. Many Japanese prisoners remained loyal to their emperor and their nation throughout their captivity and after. But for many others, the experience of adequate food, day after day, week after week, created cognitive dissonance that could not be easily resolved within the framework of Japanese military ideology. By the summer of 1945, American POW camps across the Pacific and the continental United States held approximately 5,400 Japanese prisoners, a relatively small number compared to the hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners also in American custody. The Japanese prisoners represented a tiny fraction of Japanese military personnel engaged in the war, but their existence and treatment carried symbolic weight far beyond their numbers. In August 1945, when atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan surrendered, these prisoners faced an uncertain future. Some feared they would be killed by angry Americans seeking revenge. Others worried about their eventual return to Japan, where they might face harsh judgment for the shame of surrender. What actually happened was, in many ways, more remarkable than continued detention. Most Japanese POWs were repatriated to Japan between late 1945 and early 1946. They returned home healthier than when they had been captured, having gained weight and recovered from diseases and wounds. They carried with them memories of American abundance, stories of 3 meals a day and chocolate cake and white bread that never ran out. In post-war Japan, as the nation struggled with devastation and food shortages, these former prisoners found themselves in the strange position of having eaten better as American captives than most Japanese civilians were eating in defeated Japan. Some faced suspicion or hostility for having surrendered. Others quietly integrated back into society, their experiences in American camps becoming private memories rarely shared. But those memories, and the testimonies of thousands of repatriated prisoners, contributed to the transformation of Japanese attitudes toward the United States in the post-war period. The same nation that had been portrayed as barbaric and cruel had fed and healed its enemies even while fighting a brutal war. This paradox could not be easily explained within the framework of wartime Japanese ideology. It required acknowledging that American material abundance was not weakness, but overwhelming strength, that American values which allowed for humane treatment of prisoners were not incompatible with military effectiveness, but perhaps essential to it. The occupation of Japan by American forces, which began in August 1945 and continued for years, reinforced these lessons. American troops brought with them the same abundance that had shocked Japanese prisoners: food, medicine, and material goods in quantities that demonstrated the vast gulf in productive capacity between the two nations. The story of Japanese prisoners and American POW camp food is ultimately a story about the collision between ideology and reality, between what nations tell their soldiers and what those soldiers experience when ideology meets material fact. Japanese military culture had constructed an elaborate philosophical justification for deprivation, arguing that hardship built character and that material comfort was corrosive to warrior spirit. This ideology was not entirely wrong in its observation that hardship can build resilience and that comfort can breed complacency. But it failed to account for the possibility that abundance might be a sign of strength rather than weakness, that a nation capable of feeding its prisoners 3 substantial meals a day while fighting a global war possessed resources that could not be overcome by spirit alone. The white bread that appeared at every meal in American POW camps became, for thousands of Japanese prisoners, a symbol of this uncomfortable truth. It represented an economic system that could produce more than enough, that operated on principles of efficiency and scale that Japanese industry could not match. It represented agricultural abundance made possible by mechanization and scientific farming. It represented supply chains that functioned smoothly across vast distances despite enemy action. Most fundamentally, it represented a different philosophy about the relationship between material resources and military power. Americans did not believe that deprivation built character. They believed that well-fed soldiers fought better, thought more clearly, maintained higher morale, and recovered more quickly from wounds and disease. The same logic extended to prisoners. Well-fed prisoners were healthier, more cooperative, and represented an investment in post-war relationships. This pragmatic approach to food and material resources was not uniquely American, but America's capacity to implement it at scale was unique in World War II. The Soviet Union also understood the importance of logistics and supply, but Soviet resources were strained by German invasion and massive territorial losses. Britain understood the principles but lacked the agricultural and industrial base to achieve American levels of abundance. Germany and Japan both struggled with resource constraints throughout the war, constraints that worsened as Allied forces tightened blockades and destroyed supply lines. Only the United States possessed the combination of vast agricultural capacity, industrial efficiency, and geographic security that allowed for true abundance even under wartime conditions. When Corporal Yamamoto sat in Camp McCoy in August 1945, eating chocolate cake and staring at the Wisconsin landscape. He was not just consuming food. He was consuming a lesson about power, about resources, about the fundamental forces that determine outcomes in modern industrial warfare. The lesson was not subtle. It was delivered 3 times a day, 7 days a week, in portions that spoke louder than any propaganda. And for Yamamoto, as for thousands of other Japanese prisoners, that lesson could not be unlearned or ignored. It challenged everything he had been taught about American weakness, about the virtue of sacrifice, about the inevitability of Japanese victory. The challenge was not verbal or philosophical. It was concrete and immediate, present in every bite of soft white bread, in every piece of beef that should not have existed in such quantity, in every square of chocolate cake that represented resources devoted to the comfort of prisoners. In the years after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became an American ally, the memories of former POWs contributed to a broader transformation in Japanese society's relationship with the United States. The narrative of American cruelty and barbarism that had sustained wartime propaganda could not survive contact with the testimonies of men who had experienced American captivity. This did not erase the genuine horrors of the Pacific War or absolve either side of atrocities committed, but it did create space for a more nuanced understanding of the American character and the sources of American power. The United States was not weak because it was prosperous. It was strong because prosperity reflected industrial capacity, technological innovation, and social organization that could be directed toward either peace or war with equal effectiveness.